A slap landed on her cheek and sparks jumped in her sight. She swallowed the cry that tried to rise. If she begged, they would laugh. If she fought, they would call her wicked. Faces crowded close, eager and hard. She tasted blood and kept her chin up. At the edge of the circle, one man watched like stone. His eyes did not flinch. He studied the hands that hurt her, not the tears they wanted from her. The widow tried to kill her hope, because hope had gotten her hurt before. Still, it slipped in, quiet and stubborn. Why would a powerful rancher risk his name for a woman the whole town wanted to break? Maggie Hart lived in a small house just outside Dry Creek Crossing. She woke early so she could move before most doors opened. She washed fast, pinned her dark hair tight, and pulled on a plain dress that hid what it could. The gold ring on her finger was not comfort anymore. It was a mark the town could see. It said her husband died and she was still here. 6 months earlier, Caleb Hart fell dead on their kitchen floor. The doctor said his heart failed. The town did not like simple answers. Folks said a wife does not stay quiet unless she is hiding something. They whispered poison and nodded like it was truth. Maggie remembered him coming home drunk and lifting his fist. Then his face went strange, his hand went to his chest, and he dropped hard. Maggie stood over him shaking, too shocked to even scream. After the burial, the town decided Maggie was the problem. She learned rules to survive and followed them like prayer. She took back alleys and kept her eyes low. When women muttered, she did not answer. When men stared, she did not meet their gaze. Some days the harm was small. A shoulder slammed into her as she passed. Other days it was open. A shove near the well with a voice saying she deserved it. That morning, a knock hit her door, sharp and quick. Prudence Harlow stood on the step in a fine hat and a neat smile. She spoke of prayer and forgiveness, but her eyes stayed cold. She said the Ladies' Aid was meeting, and Maggie should come confess. Maggie told her no, soft but steady. Mrs. Harlow warned that the town was tired of waiting. Then she mentioned the bank, saying debt collectors do not have patience for widows. When she left, Maggie felt smaller than her own doorway. Wade Kincaid watched the town from a low rise outside the creek. He used an old brass spyglass and kept his hand steady. Through the lens, he saw Maggie leave her house with a basket and stiff shoulders. He saw how folks made space around her, like her grief could stain them. His foreman, Luis Ortega, rode up and spoke low. Luis said the bank was being pushed to call Maggie's debt, and the saloon men were talking about a public lesson. Wade lowered the spyglass and breathed out once. He told Luis to follow close and keep quiet. By late morning, the market square was packed with wagons and voices. Maggie chose the busy time on purpose, because crowds made it harder for one cruel person to corner her. She paid for potatoes and dried beans without looking up. The old farmer took her coins like they were dirty. A mother pulled her child away as Maggie passed. Someone crossed themselves like Maggie carried a curse. Maggie tried to finish fast, but she felt eyes tracking her all the same. Near the well, an old woman stumbled and her cane clacked on stone. A voice shouted that Maggie had tripped her. Maggie had not been close enough to touch her, but the lie landed because the town wanted it. People gathered, faces bright with blame. Prudence Harlow stepped forward and spoke about safety and godliness, as if cruelty was duty. Hands closed in behind Maggie, blocking her way out. Prudence knocked Maggie's basket from her arms and food rolled into the dust. Maggie bent to gather it, and a shove slammed her into a post. Maggie tried to pull free, but 2 more hands pressed her from behind. The circle tightened, and the air felt thin. Maggie saw faces she recognized, neighbors who once borrowed sugar, now watching her like she was not human. She lifted her chin anyway, because dignity was the only thing they had not taken. Then a rifle cracked once, sharp and final. The square went dead still. Hooves struck stone in a slow, steady beat, and the crowd parted on instinct. Wade Kincaid rode in on his bay stallion, rifle in hand, thin smoke lifting from the barrel. Wade walked to Maggie and crouched beside her scattered food. He picked up each piece and set it back into her basket, patient as if time belonged to him. When he stood, his eyes met Maggie's, steady and clear. He faced the crowd and spoke in a deep, plain voice. He said the next hand laid on Maggie's heart would answer to him. He did not shout, and he did not need to. Then he turned back to Maggie and lowered his voice. He said she could refuse what he was about to do, and he would still walk her out of danger today. Wade lifted his chin and spoke so everyone could hear. He said Maggie Hart would be his bride, and under his name she would be protected. Silence spread across the square, and even the birds seemed to stop. Prudence Harlow's face tightened with rage she could not hide. Louise watched from the edge, ready for trouble. Wade held out his arm to Maggie, steady and patient, giving her the choice in front of everyone. Maggie stared at him, heart pounding, because a name could be a shield, but it could also be a cage. If she took his arm, would she be protected, or would she owe him a life she could not give? The market square stayed silent after the rifle crack. Dust hovered in the sunlight, and even the wagons seemed to pause. Maggie kept one hand on her bruised cheek and the other on her basket handle. Wade Kincaid did not rush her or pull her. He offered his arm and waited, like the choice belonged to her, not the town. Prudence Harlow stood at the edge of the circle, lips tight, eyes sharp. Maggie looked at Wade's steady gaze and stepped toward the only safety she could see. She took his arm. A low murmur rolled through the crowd, half anger and half fear. Wade crouched and gathered her scattered food, placing each piece back into her basket like it mattered. Then he guided her forward, through the parted bodies. Luis Ortega rode in close on Wade's left, scanning hands and pockets. Someone muttered that Maggie was cursed, but the voice sounded smaller than it wanted to. Wade spoke once, calm as Riverstone, telling them to step back. No one argued with him. Maggie kept her eyes on the boardwalk planks and walked like she belonged to the air in front of her. Sheriff Dean Carver's office smelled of ink and pine sap. Dean looked from Wade to Maggie, and his jaw worked like he was chewing trouble. Wade told him to open the registry and write it down now. Dean asked if Wade understood what he was doing. Wade said he did, and he would not let rumor shape the story first. Dean asked Maggie her full name, and she said it clear. He asked if she agreed to marry under territorial law. Maggie thought of hands on her arms and voices calling it virtue. She said yes. Dean asked Wade the same, and Wade said yes without blinking. The wax seal pressed down with a soft crack that made Maggie's throat tighten. Dean spoke the legal words and signed as witness. When they stepped onto the boardwalk, the crowd still waited, hungry for an ending. Prudence Harlow raised her voice and called the marriage a stain on Dry Creek Crossing. Wade stopped and faced her, his voice low and steady. He said a decent town would not strike a woman in daylight and call it righteousness. The crowd shifted at that, because everyone knew how much of their money touched his name. Maggie saw men glance at each other, doing quick math in their heads. Prudence's eyes flicked, and her smile returned, thin and dangerous. She said the Lord sees all, and no man can buy his way past judgment. Wade answered that the Lord might see all, but so did he. He said he saw every shove and every lie, and he had a long memory. Prudence went quiet, and the quiet felt like a promise of more trouble later. Wade did not wait for her next move. Wade's bay stallion waited, restless but trained. Luis held the reins while Wade helped Maggie mount behind him. Wade's hand stayed firm on her forearm, and then he stepped away, giving her space even as he protected her. Wade swung into the saddle and guided the horse toward the road out of town. Maggie held the saddle horn, not his waist, because she did not know what closeness was allowed. The town's eyes followed them like thrown stones that could not reach. As the buildings thinned, the air felt wider, but her chest still felt tight. Wade spoke without turning back. He said she could stay in her own house if she wanted, and he would still keep his word. Maggie answered honest. She said a house does not protect you when a town decides you are the enemy. She said they would wait until Wade rode out, then come at night, quiet and cruel. Wade nodded once, like he had already pictured it. Maggie asked why he watched her for so long and did nothing sooner. Wade's shoulders tightened and then eased. He said he once believed silence could keep peace, and he learned it only keeps cruelty comfortable. The iron gate of the Kincaid Ranch rose ahead, simple but strong. With his brand burned into the wood, ranch hands paused as they rode through, some lifting their hats, some staring in quiet surprise. A tall woman stood on the porch with gray hair pinned tight and an apron tied firm. Wade introduced her as Mrs. Dobbs, the housekeeper, and said Maggie would be treated with respect. Mrs. Dobbs looked Maggie over with a hard, practical gaze, then nodded once, like she had decided Maggie was a person and not a rumor. Maggie followed her inside, startled by the smell of bread and clean soap. Maggie's room sat in the east wing, bright with late sun. Fresh linens covered the bed, and a trunk stood at the foot of it. Maggie's hands went to her mouth, because the trunk was hers. Luis appeared in the doorway and said he rode back for her things while she was at the sheriff's office. Maggie's eyes filled before she could stop them, and she hated how weak that felt. Mrs. Dobbs softened, only a little, and said fear takes time to leave the body. That night, supper was quiet, and Wade kept space between their chairs like a promise. He spoke little, but when he did, it was gentle and clear. A knock came after dark, quick and tense. Luis stepped in with a paper in his hand, damp from night air. He said it was nailed to the gatepost, and the rider had vanished into the prairie. Wade read it once and folded it neat, like hate did not deserve to spread out in his hands. He handed it to Maggie, and her stomach dropped as she read the scrawl. It promised a town would drag her back into the square and make her confess to a crime she did not commit. Wade took the paper back and said tomorrow she would ride into Dry Creek Crossing beside him in full daylight. Morning came cold and bright, and Maggie hardly slept. The threat note sat folded on the table, heavy as a stone. Mrs. Dobbs set coffee and biscuits down, but Maggie could not eat more than a bite. Wade came in, already dressed, hat in hand, eyes sharp from a night with little rest. He looked at the bruise on Maggie's cheek and the cut on her palm. His face stayed calm, but his jaw tightened once. He said they would ride into Dry Creek Crossing in full daylight. Maggie nodded, because hiding never saved her. They rode in with the sun at their backs and dust rising under the hooves. Luis followed a few lengths behind, quiet and ready. Folks on the road slowed and stared as if a parade had come through. Some men lifted their hats out of habit, then dropped their eyes like shame burned. Women gathered near the dry goods store, whispering behind lace fans and gloved hands. Maggie kept her shoulders squared and her gaze forward. She stayed close to Wade, not as a prisoner, but as a statement. Prudence Harlow stepped out onto the boardwalk in her best dress, face set in a practiced smile. She spoke about peace, faith, and public safety, like cruelty was a holy task. She said a widow could end all this if she confessed, and begged forgiveness. Maggie answered that she would not confess to a lie. Prudence's eyes flashed, and she warned Wade that he was tying his name to evil. Wade did not argue long, because arguing fed her. He said the next person who touched Maggie would answer to him. His voice carried far enough for the watchers to hear, and it left no room for games. Wade guided his horse to the bank and dismounted first. He helped Maggie down with a careful grip, then walked beside her through the door. The bank smelled of paper, ink, and stale sweat from nervous men. Mr. Miller stood behind the counter with his shoulders hunched. He said there had been pressure to call Maggie's loan and seize her house. Maggie heard fear in his voice, but also regret. Wade placed a folded document on the counter and told Mr. Miller to read it. Mr. Miller's hands shook as he opened it. Wade said the loan was paid in full, and the deed would be released today. Mr. Miller tried to protest, then swallowed his words. Wade's voice stayed calm as he said this was not charity and not a favor. He said debt had been used like a rope, and he was cutting it. Maggie leaned in and spoke for herself, even though her throat felt tight. She said she wanted her name cleared on every line of that ledger. Mr. Miller nodded and reached for the stamp. When they stepped back outside, the crowd had thickened around the bank door. News in Dry Creek Crossing ran faster than horses. Someone shouted that Wade was a fool to marry a cursed woman. Another voice called Maggie a witch, and a few people laughed, sharp and nervous. Wade walked into the center of the square with Maggie at his side and looked from face to face. He said his ranch hired half the town, and his contracts fed the other half. He said any man who raised a hand to his wife would lose work on his land before the sun set. Maggie felt a clean heat rise in her chest, and she stepped one pace forward on her own. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. She told them she buried a husband who hurt her, and she still did not wish death on anyone. She told them she asked only to be left in peace, and they answered with shame and bruises. She told them she was done lowering her eyes and slipping through alleys like a thief. She said if they wanted to accuse her, they could bring proof and speak it in the open. Her last words fell into the quiet, and she did not look away. The ride back felt longer, as if her body was paying for every brave word. Wade watched the road, then spoke low. He said the town once did the same thing to his first wife, Hannah, when sickness spread and fear needed a target. He said she tried to help with simple remedies, and the town called her wicked for knowing things they did not. He said he stayed silent, thinking money and distance would protect her. He said silence only gave the cruel more room. Maggie listened, hearing the regret under every word. Night settled over the ranch, and lanterns bobbed between barns like slow stars. Maggie had just started to feel her shoulders loosen when a shout cut the quiet. Luis ran up from the gate with his coat flapping, breath hard. He said a rider had slipped close, and the latch had been tampered with. Wade grabbed his rifle and headed for the north barn without a word. Maggie followed, heart pounding, refusing to be left behind again. The air near the barn smelled wrong, sharp and oily under the sweet hay. Wade stopped short, then crouched and lifted a rag from the hay, and it was soaked in lamp oil. A lantern lay smashed in the grass, its glass glittering like broken ice. A fire could have taken the whole barn in minutes, and the horses inside would have screamed and trampled each other blind. Luis circled the building, but the rider was gone. Wade stared into the darkness past the corral, breathing slow through his nose. Then he turned to Maggie and said the town was done with daylight cruelty. He said they were coming for her in the dark. Wade tightened the ranch without turning it into a circus. 2 men stayed near the barn, and 1 stayed by the gate at all times. The chain on the gate stayed on even in daylight. Maggie noticed the way the hands watched the open prairie, like they expected a rider to rise from the grass. Mrs. Dobbs checked every latch twice and kept the lamps low. The house felt safe, but it also felt like a place bracing for a storm that had not arrived yet. After supper, Wade asked Maggie to stay inside when night fell. Maggie held his gaze and said she would not spend another season hiding. Her voice stayed calm, but her fingers curled tight around her cup. She told him fear had already taken too much from her. Wade nodded once, slow and careful, as if he was changing a rule in his own head. He said he would not cage her, and he would not lose her either. Maggie believed him, and that belief scared her, because she had not let herself lean on anyone in a very long time. She went to the stables with a lantern while the last light faded. The horses shifted at her steps, smelling her and deciding what she was. Wade stood by his stallion, brushing the coat with steady strokes that sounded like rain on canvas. He looked up and asked if she was cold. Maggie said no, but she kept her shawl tight anyway. She watched his hands and saw the quiet patience in them. It did not match the stories the town told about him, and that made her curious. In the far stall, a black mare paced, ears pinned, eyes white at the edges. Luis had told Maggie the mare was wild-caught and mean with fear. Maggie stopped a few paces away and spoke low, like she was talking to a skittish child. She held her hand out, palm open, and waited. The mare snorted and tested the air, then stepped closer, inch by inch. When the warm breath touched Maggie's fingers, Maggie felt a strange relief, like something in her chest loosened. Wade watched, surprise plain in his face, and he did not move. Maggie stroked the mare's neck with slow, careful movements. The mare's muscles eased, and her head lowered a fraction. Wade did not step in or take over. He let Maggie do it her way, even though it would have been easy for him to claim the moment as his. Maggie looked at Wade and said she did not know why animals trusted her. Wade answered that animals knew the difference between hands that demanded and hands that asked. The words landed deep, because Maggie knew he was not only talking about horses. The next morning, a rider came to the gate with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Luis opened it outside, away from the barns, and his face hardened. Inside was a bundle of dead weeds, tied with twine and a scrap of paper. The message was a warning dressed up like scripture. It said the town would not let the ranch keep what belonged to judgment. Maggie felt her stomach turn cold. Wade took the scrap, tore it into pieces, and let the wind carry it. That afternoon, Wade rode into Dry Creek Crossing for feed contracts, and he made Maggie promise she would not go past the yard fence. Maggie agreed, because she could feel trouble pressing closer. She went to her trunk and tried to put her few things in better order, just to quiet her hands. At the bottom, she found Caleb's old coat, the one he wore on cold nights when he came home sour and loud. The smell of smoke and stale drink clung to it, and her throat tightened. Maggie almost shoved it back, but something inside her said not to run from the past anymore. She worked the seam with her fingers, and a folded letter slipped out. The paper was thick and clean, nothing like the rough notes Caleb scribbled at the table. Maggie opened it and read the neat script, and the room seemed to tilt. It spoke of Caleb's debts, of a payment offered for a righteous act, and of a powder that would leave no trace. It said he must put it in his wife's tea. At the bottom was a pressed wax seal stamped with a small cross, and Maggie knew that seal from church papers. Her knees went weak, and she sat on the bed, shaking. When Wade returned at sundown, Maggie met him in the hall with the letter held in both hands. Wade read it once, then again, slower, as if the second time might turn it into a lie. His face went still, but his eyes turned hard as flint. Maggie told him Caleb's last words, the ones she did not understand until now. She said he whispered that he would not do it, and then he fell. Wade breathed out, low and controlled, and said the town had been hunting the wrong person. He said they would take this to Sheriff Carver at first light, then send for the county marshal in Red Bluff. Night settled heavy and quiet, and Maggie could not sleep. Wind moved through the cottonwoods, making the branches tap the roof like soft knuckles. Sometime after midnight, a faint creak came from the back porch steps. Maggie slid from bed and opened her door just enough to see the hall. Wade stood there already, dressed, rifle in hand, listening like a man who had spent years hearing danger before it arrived. Another creak came, closer this time, and a shadow crossed the window as if someone paused to listen for her breathing. Maggie stood barefoot on the cold floor, heart beating so loud she felt sure it would give her away. Wade held his rifle low, not pointed at the house but at the dark beyond the window. Another creak sounded from the porch boards. It was careful, measured, like a man trying to move without weight. Wade lifted one finger to his lips, then nodded toward the back door. Maggie could see his shoulders tighten, then settle. He had gone still in a way that made the whole house feel like it was holding its breath. Mrs. Dobbs opened her door a crack at the far end of the hall, lantern covered with her hand. Her eyes met Maggie's, steady and worried. Luis appeared from the side room with a pistol and a knife in his belt. Wade gave Luis a short nod, then eased toward the back door. Maggie followed 2 steps behind, not because she wanted danger, but because she refused to be left in the dark without truth again. The air smelled of wood smoke and night wind, and Maggie felt the old fear crawl up her spine like a cold hand. Wade eased the latch open without a sound. The porch boards complained once, soft and sharp. A shadow moved near the railing, bent low, working at something with both hands. In the faint moonlight, Maggie saw a small bottle tilt and a wet rag dragged along the wood. Lamp oil, the same stink she smelled near the barn. Wade stepped out like a ghost, quiet and sudden. He grabbed the man's collar and slammed him against the porch post before the man could draw breath to shout. The intruder fought hard for 2 seconds, then froze when Wade's rifle barrel pressed under his jaw. Luis jumped in, wrenching the man's hands behind his back. The man's hat fell off, and Maggie saw his face. It was Cal Hensley, a hired hand from town, the kind that drank loud and laughed at other people's pain. His eyes were wide now, not brave at all. He tried to spit, but his mouth was too dry. Wade told him to talk. Cal said he was only teaching the witch a lesson. Wade did not move the rifle. He asked who paid him. Cal's eyes flicked toward the dark, toward the road back to town, like he could see safety waiting there. Luis tightened his grip until Cal's knees buckled. Cal swore and said he did not want trouble with Wade Kincaid. Wade's voice stayed low and flat as he said trouble was already here. Maggie stepped forward into the moonlight. Her hands shook, but her voice held. She asked Cal why the town hated her so much. Cal laughed once, weak and bitter, then stopped when Wade's eyes cut to him. Cal said it started with Prudence Harlow. He said she told folks Maggie was dangerous, that a widow who did not cry enough was hiding sin. He said she told them the Lord wanted Dry Creek Crossing clean. Maggie felt her stomach drop, even though she already knew that name was tied to the seal on the letter. Wade asked about the powder. Cal's face tightened like he had bitten something rotten. He said he heard talk at the saloon that Caleb Hart took money from Prudence to do what she wanted. He said Caleb came back from her house drunk the night he died, shaking and angry. Cal said Caleb claimed he was done being used, then stormed home. Cal swallowed hard and admitted he heard Prudence boasting later that the poison was gone and the widow would still be blamed. Maggie's breath caught and her fingers curled into her palms until her nails bit skin. Wade told Louise to tie Cal's wrists and bring him inside. Mrs. Dobbs stood in the doorway with a lantern, face hard as iron. She did not look shocked. She looked tired, like she had seen men hurt women before and hated it every time. Cal tried to bargain, saying he could disappear if Wade let him go. Wade answered that disappearing was what wicked people did when they wanted to keep hurting others. He said Cal would ride to the sheriff at first light, and the county marshal would hear every word. Maggie sat at the kitchen table while Cal slumped in a chair with rope cutting his wrists. The lamp made the room feel small, and Maggie could not stop staring at Cal's hands. She remembered hands grabbing her in the square. She remembered her basket hitting the dust. Wade poured coffee and set a cup in front of Maggie, then one in front of himself. His hand brushed hers once by accident, and he paused, like he was asking permission without words. Maggie did not pull away. The touch did not feel like control. It felt like a steadying post in strong wind. Before dawn, Wade saddled his stallion and loaded Cal onto a spare horse. Luis rode on one side, rifle across his lap. Maggie rode on the other, wrapped in her shawl, eyes burning from lack of sleep. The prairie air was sharp, and frost glittered on the grass like broken glass. When Dry Creek Crossing came into view, Maggie felt her stomach twist, but Wade rode on like the town was just another patch of dirt he owned. At the sheriff's office, Dean Carver looked at Cal, then at Wade, and his face tightened. Dean listened to Cal's story in a grim silence. He took the letter Maggie found in the coat and turned it over twice, seeing the cross seal. He wrote everything down slow and neat, like words could become chains. Then he sent a rider for the county marshal in Red Bluff, fast as the horse could run. Maggie watched Dean's pen move and felt something strange rise in her chest. Not hope yet, something closer to a hard, clean readiness. By noon, Marshal Amos Crowley rode in with dust on his coat and tired eyes. He did not smile. He read the letter, questioned Cal, and listened to Dean's notes. He asked Maggie to tell her story in her own words. Maggie spoke about Caleb's fists, his debts, his fear. She spoke about the market square and the basket in the dust. She spoke about the threat nailed to the gate, She kept her voice simple because the truth did not need fancy words. When she finished, the marshal nodded once and said this was enough to act. Marshal Crowley said he would not arrest Prudence in the dark like a thief. He said evil that hides behind church talk must be pulled into daylight. He asked where Prudence would be in 1 hour. Dean said she would be at the Ladies' Aid meeting in the church hall, holding court like she always did. The marshal looked at Wade and asked if Wade would keep his temper. Wade answered yes, but his eyes went cold. Maggie felt Wade's anger like heat beside her, and she understood it was not only for her. It was for Hannah, too, and for every woman fear had tried to silence. They walked to the church hall together. Maggie's boots felt heavy on the boardwalk, but she did not slow. People saw the marshal and started to follow, curiosity pulling them like rope. The hall door stood open, and Prudence's voice floated out, sweet as syrup and just as false. Maggie stepped inside and saw Prudence at the front, hands folded, face lifted like a saint. Then Prudence's eyes landed on Maggie, and the smile on her face tightened. The room went quiet, because everyone felt the shift. Prudence asked what Maggie was doing there. Maggie held the letter up in plain sight. Marshal Crowley stepped forward and said Prudence Harlow was under arrest for conspiracy and attempted murder. Prudence's face went pale for half a breath, then her chin lifted again. She said the paper was a lie, and Maggie was a cursed woman trying to ruin a godly town. The crowd stirred, and Maggie felt the old fear twitch in her ribs. Then Prudence's gaze slid past Maggie, past Wade, toward the side door, and Maggie saw it. She was planning to run. Maggie moved first. She stepped into Prudence Harlow's path before the woman could reach the side door. Her knees wanted to shake, but she planted her boots like roots. The room smelled of old wood and cheap perfume. Every eye turned to Maggie, waiting for her to fold. Prudence's smile returned, tight and proud. She spoke like Maggie was dirt under her shoe, and she said a widow had no right to stand in a church hall and accuse a righteous woman. Maggie held the letter higher so everyone could see the seal. Marshal Amos Crowley told Prudence to put her hands out. Prudence did not. She lifted her chin and began to speak about the Lord and purity, like those words could stop iron. Wade Kincaid stood beside Maggie, still as stone. His silence had weight. Prudence's eyes darted again, searching for an exit, searching for a friend. The room had been hers for years, but now it felt colder. The marshal stepped forward again and said her choice was simple. She could come quiet, or she could be taken. Prudence's hand flashed toward her pocket. For a breath, Maggie thought it was a pistol. It was not. It was a small glass vial that caught the light. Maggie's stomach turned, because she knew what poison looked like now. Prudence lifted it like a holy object and said this town would stay clean, even if she had to do God's work herself. The marshal lunged, but Prudence tried to smash the vial against her teeth. Wade moved faster than the story said he could. He caught her wrist and twisted, controlled but brutal. The vial clinked onto the floorboards instead of into her mouth. The room erupted in gasps. Marshal Crowley pinned Prudence's arms and snapped cuffs on her wrists. Prudence did not cry. She hissed like a cornered thing. She turned her head toward Maggie and said Maggie should have died the night Caleb fell. Maggie felt the words cut, but she did not flinch. The marshal asked, loud enough for all to hear, if Prudence had paid Caleb Hart to poison his wife. Prudence's eyes narrowed, and she tried to laugh it off. Then the marshal held up the vial and said the apothecary mark on the glass matched a supplier in Red Bluff. Prudence's face changed, not into fear, but into rage. She said men like Caleb were weak and easy to bend with money. She said she offered him payment to remove sin from the town. Her voice rose, and she said she would have done it herself if she had to. The confession hung in the air, thick and ugly. Some women in the hall backed away from her like they had backed away from Maggie for months. A few men stared at the floor like it might open and swallow them. Maggie looked at the faces that once watched her bruises and did nothing, and she saw shock, shame, and relief all mixed together. Prudence was taken to the sheriff's office under guard, the boardwalk outside filled with people who followed like a tide. Maggie walked beside Wade, but she did not hide behind him. She wanted them to see her standing. Sheriff Dean Carver looked like he had aged 10 years in one morning. He wrote down the confession, the vial, the letter, and Cal Hensley's statement. Marshal Crowley sent riders for the county judge and 2 witnesses from the supplier in Red Bluff. The town tried to whisper again, but the marshal shut it down with a hard look. He said this was not gossip now. This was law. That night, Maggie sat at Wade's table with a cup of coffee warming her hands. Her bruises still ached, but something in her chest felt different. The fear was not gone, but it had less power. Wade sat across from her, hat on the peg, rifle resting by the door. He looked tired, not from work, but from carrying anger for too long. He told Maggie he was sorry he waited until the square to step in. Maggie answered that stepping in at all mattered, because most men never did. Wade's eyes lowered, and he said he once let a good woman stand alone while a town picked her apart. Maggie understood he meant Hannah, and she did not ask for more. 2 days later, the hearing was held in the county room above the bank. The space was crowded and hot, and the air smelled like sweat and dust. Prudence stood in front with her hands cuffed, still trying to look holy. Marshal Crowley read the charges in a clear voice. Sheriff Carver presented the letter and the vial. Cal spoke with fear in his eyes, but his words held. When the marshal asked Prudence again if she paid Caleb to poison Maggie, Prudence tried to deny it this time. Then the marshal read her confession from the church hall, and her face went tight and gray. The judge ruled fast. Prudence would be held for trial in Red Bluff, and her property would be seized pending the case. The judge also ruled that Maggie's name would be cleared in the county record, because the only proof ever offered against her was rumor. Maggie felt her breath catch when those words landed. It was not a hug or a kiss or a grand speech. It was a clean sentence spoken by law. And it felt like the first real breath she had taken in months. Outside the room, some townsfolk avoided Maggie's eyes, but a few nodded, small and unsure, like they did not know how to be decent yet. The next week, Maggie returned to Dry Creek Crossing in daylight with Wade at her side, not to shop fast and flee, but to open the door of a small front room near the square. Mrs. Dobbs helped scrub it clean, and Luis nailed a new sign over the entrance. It read Heart Remedies in simple letters, because Maggie knew how to mix basic tonics and salves, the kind her mother taught her back east. Maggie did not pretend to be a doctor. She only offered what she knew, honest and steady. When a ranch hand came in with a swollen wrist, Maggie wrapped it and gave him willow bark tea. When a child came in coughing, Maggie warmed honey and herbs and sat the mother down until her shoulders eased. Wade watched her work from the doorway the first day, quiet and proud. Maggie caught him looking at her like she was something rare and worth guarding. She felt warmth rise in her face, and she turned back to her jars so the room would not see it. Later, when the sun dipped, Wade walked her home to the ranch like it was the most normal thing in the world. At the porch steps, he stopped and asked if she regretted marrying him. Maggie looked at the yard, the barns, the open sky, and the life that finally felt possible. She said she did not regret it. Then she surprised herself by reaching up and taking his hand. Wade's breath hitched like he did not expect kindness to be offered to him. He did not pull her close. He waited, like he always did, giving her the choice. Maggie stepped in, and Wade wrapped his arms around her, careful and strong. It was not a show. It was quiet, the kind of love that grows after pain. Maggie rested her cheek against his coat and felt steady heat instead of fear. She told him she did not want a marriage that was only a shield anymore. Wade held her a little tighter and said he wanted the same. The prairie wind moved through the cottonwoods, and for once, it sounded like peace. If you felt this tale in your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Emotional Tales, where every story rides through the dust, the danger, and the kind of love that never dies. See you in the next tale, partner.